How did you get involved in municipal electoral reform?
It was the 2005 election and the Citizens Assembly originally. I was the Citizens Assembly process um, educated me a lot about the different voting systems and the advantages and disadvantages of each. And through that process, I started to learn about proportional systems that I liked more than the ones I had previously heard of. And that and the more I learned about other voting systems, the less and less I liked the ones we use today.
That's totally fair. So other jurisdictions, other municipalities have looked into municipal electoral reform. Do you know much about that?
Yes, in fact, this is one of the most common reforms implemented when municipalities choose to reform and to give voters more choice. In Ontario, we've seen a different course. They've gone to ranked ballots, and that is something that they're continuing to pursue there. But in many other places, they've gone to cumulative voting. In fact, some cases they've been forced to by the courts. People have taken municipalities to court, and this is particularly common in the United States. And they've sued them by saying that the voters aren't getting the results, that the results of the elections aren't reflecting the votes cast, and therefore that's unconstitutional, and the courts generally agree with them. And the courts then set a minimum standard of what a more constitutional, more fair voting system would be. And this is one of the few systems that has proven to meet that bar. Cumulative voting is also in extensive use somewhere else in North America, interestingly, and that is to elect corporate boards. Many jurisdictions now require corporations, if incorporated within their borders, to use cumulative voting as the way that their corporate boards are elected, because it has been proven to reflect the will of the shareholders far more closely. And we also have these case studies of municipalities in the US where they have switched from something similar to what we use here in British Columbia today to cumulative voting, and found that the before and after, the elections before were not very representative of the community, and the elections afterwards were far more representative of the community. You most commonly see this in racially divided communities in the US, where a community is perhaps 60% white and 40% black, and before cumulative voting, you would get nothing but white politicians almost every election. After cumulative voting, you would typically get something close to that 60-40 split, or whatever the split in the community is, because the cumulative voting results consistently reflect the votes cast much more closely.
I've heard really great things about cumulative voting, and I've actually heard Vancouver, they had an independent elections task force that first recommended STV, but if the province wouldn't allow that, then they could implement cumulative voting as soon as the next election.
Yeah, and that's cool, because STV is a great system, but there's a bigger, and I support it, but there is a bigger educational curve to educate a voter of how to fill out an STV ballot. There's a bigger threshold in, I think, in trying to convince politicians to go along with it, because it's a radical change from what we currently have. Cumulative voting comes up with results nearly as good as STV, and when you look at corporate boards, when you look at municipalities in the US, and yet with a system that is only very subtly changed over what we have. So the educational component for the voter is much less. All you do is change the instructions to say that instead of having to only put one vote per candidate, they can put multiple votes per candidate if they wish to, but they're still limited to the number of votes they have. So the the more votes you cast for one person, the more likely to elect that person, but the fewer people you might participate in the election of. So there's still a fairness there. You know, you look at something like Vancouver. Vancouver very rarely has any municipal politicians elected that that are advocating for the downtown east side traditionally of Vancouver. Under cumulative voting, voters in the downtown east side, if they wished, could rally behind one or two candidates. They would have a high probability of getting those candidates elected, but they would also guarantee that they only elect one or two people. So you're trading off the ability to participate in electing a bunch of people to, but you know, a low likelihood of electing a bunch of people to a high likelihood of electing a small number of people. So it's that there's still a fairness there, but it allows a neighborhood to band together, or it allows people that share a certain political ideology to band together. They guarantee themselves minority representation, but they guarantee themselves some representation typically. And that's where cumulative voting is a winner, because under our current system, it's very common to have what is referred to as block voting, where you might get the entire council elected with 60% of the people in the municipality all feel a certain way, and so they win every seat. Whereas what you really want is 60% of the seats in that example to go to people who of that political stripe. They're still a majority. They'll still, probably get their way on council, but you want the other voices heard. You want those other voices discussed. You want the reporters in the room to report on those other voices on council. And that's where cumulative voting might not change the political, might not be a sea change, but it would guarantee minority voices are heard in most cases.
Absolutely, and we want to make sure that minority voices are heard, because
because we can point to lots of examples where a slim majority of voters in a municipality won every seat on council, and that's not healthy. And you even get craziness where you'll go from one election, a majority are left-leaning, and the next election a majority are right-leaning, or like you'll even see examples of almost every seat going to a left-leaning group, and then the next election almost every seat going to a right-leaning group, because a very small percentage of voters change their mind. You know, it's like 55-45 one election, and then 55-45 the other way the next election. And that kind of thing is unhealthy for democracy, because if you're a developer in that municipality, that's terrible for you, because you don't have any. You go from being totally supported one election to having no support the next election, but these developments take years to complete. You know, you need your voice heard all the time, whether it's the majority or the minority. Similarly, if you're a green activist, and opposed to a developer, well, again, whether you're in the majority or the minority, you want your voice heard all the time. So,
are there other chapters of Fair Vote or other organizations that are working on municipal reform?
Yeah, there are some. In Ontario, there are several groups that are very focused on that, because they actually have on the books the ability to switch to ranked ballots, whether they're and even proportional ranked ballots if they wish to. So there are many groups in Ontario that are pushing for their municipalities to do that. There are many groups in the US that are pushing for cumulative voting. But I think a lot of the groups are very focused on provincial reform, federal reform, and I personally think that shooting right now for municipal reform is more advantageous, because it's lower hanging fruit. We can accomplish it more easily, and then once you have people voting under a proportional system municipally and the sky doesn't fall, well, this is an incredible educational opportunity for voters to learn how proportionality works, and that is a good thing, not a bad, and that this will also educate reporters. Some of the reporting I when there's a referendum for provincial reform or whatever going on, I'm left with the impression that the reporters could benefit from some education, and that having them report on municipal elections with proportional systems would be beneficial to them for that as well. And that would be good for the public, because so much of their understanding of it comes through that media filter.
Absolutely. And I recall that Fair Vote actually did a study on the media bias in the BC referendum most recently, and the results were quite shocking.
Yeah, and I don't want to attack reporters. I have sympathy for the fact that they've never voted this way. So but sometimes in life there's a tendency to favor the devil you know rather than the devil you don't. So I think this is an opportunity to get people voting proportionally, and reporters reporting on proportional elections. And when they see that not only does the sky not fall, but oh wow, the elections are much more closely reflecting the will of the voters, hey, this is a good thing.
Not only that, but I think there's also an introduction of some more civility during the elections between candidates as well.
Yes, if with cumulative voting, you have the interesting thing that if there are 8 people to be elected, you could vote for 8 people. If you can find 8 people you agree with, which can be really hard. And in fact, we see that the more people to be elected there are in a municipal election, the more wasted votes there are. So if there are 4 people to be elected, you might get as many as 15% of the votes not cast. But by the time you're talking this, 8 people to be elected in Victoria, like 10 or so to be elected in Vancouver, you're now getting up into the 30-40% of votes that could be cast that aren't. So people are being forced to waste their votes because they can't find enough people on the ballot that they agree with politically. And so someone who does have 8 people on the ballot they like versus someone who has only 5 people on the ballot they like, that's terribly unfair to the person who only can find 5 candidates they like, because they're disenfranchised by 3 votes. But yes, civility could be improved, because it's not just good enough to demonize everyone on the ballot but you and 7 other people if you're a candidate who is campaigning. You have the opportunity, if you can stand out, to get maybe 2 or 3 of someone's 8 votes in that example. And therefore, being a negative politician could actually hurt you with voters who are looking for something more positive, which many voters are. So.
Sounds good. So you can find out more about what we are working on at Vote Canada Westshore chapter by joining our Facebook group. On our group, you'll find a link to a blog that links to Fair Vote Canada's blog, where I wrote about municipal electoral reform. You can also follow us on Twitter at Fair Westshore. That is the Twitter handle, at Fair Westshore. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.